It is now becoming clear that the integral stage requires a series of conversations devoted especially to lower right systems in economics, politics, computation, etc. How do systems operate? How can they work better with the other quadrants? What counts as a higher level version of systems? And what projects do or might implement phenomenon that increase autonomy, communion, security, well-being, and unforced developmental acceleration all at the same time? So here we are. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is Evan, part 2, take 1. Hey, Evan.
How's it going?
Last time we started out talking about the notion that scale variance is often overlooked in discussions of fractal and hierarchical governance, and we ended up talking about why astrology might be useful even if it's wrong. And I think you said you had a bunch of notes or prompts we hadn't gotten to yet. So what were those? Where would you go next in this conversation?
So one of the things that sort of stuck out in my mind as I was thinking, we're sort of reflecting on our first conversation and, thinking about directions we could take this. Obviously, people like us, the sort of people that are going to be talking on podcasts and very online and so on, have certain things in common usually. And, I was rereading some of David Chapman's work over on meaningness and looking at one of his sort of new intro to meta-rationality on the Eggplant site. And, he basically has this phrase somewhere in there that he talks about being an oblivious geek, right? And I think that a lot of these sorts of, discussions are, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else, are the sort of discussions that are had by and for oblivious geeks, right? And so, this is an interesting sort of starting point because he's talking about this in the context of the sort of map territory metaphor and why even that itself can be misleading as perhaps an oversimplification. And I guess the way I'd summarize that is saying that, he talks about how maps are a particularly easy class of representation to get your head around, right? And they have particularly easy to see failure modes. And yet most classes of representation that we deal with as humans or as engineers or as scientists or, what have you, are actually quite a bit trickier than just the simple map as a representation and have interesting and subtle failure modes that are not immediately captured by the map and territory metaphor. So I guess the reason I bring that up in this context is because it makes me wonder, so with respect to governance, with respect to the organization of society, in what sort of areas are we just being oblivious geek, like individually and collectively throughout the sort of broader constellation of conversations like this one that have been happening recently? And so that sort of ties into a second idea, which I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is the idea of tradition and both the positives and negatives of tradition and traditional lifeways. I forget who said this, but there's a quote that I love that goes something along the lines of traditions are the solutions to problems that you've forgotten that you had. Mm-hmm. If you give up the tradition, you get back the problems. So as a way to sort of frame what I've been thinking about along these lines recently, I think those two sort of lines of thought come together nicely because what sort of people are the ones who want to throw away traditions? Well, by and large, present company very much included, myself at least, oblivious geeks who are like, oh, cool, we've got this really nice system that says things are going to work out this way and that way and the other way. So we can just be guaranteed if we just do it this way, then we're going to have great results, And then, of course, we end up having the same sort of problems that tradition was designed as a weird word, but perhaps evolved as a better word to deal with. And so I've been sort of trying to go back through my own personal development as a thinker with respect to politics, systems design, all of these kinds of things, and ask myself, okay, so where have I cast aside tradition without understanding it? And I think we hit a little bit about this with the first conversation, talking about Chesterton's fence and all, but that's really what's been on my mind, especially, going through and in my own personal life, like establishing a relationship with a new place to live and the systems, both natural and artificial, which are already present there, and trying to really feel into that and balance the demands of, okay, I need to do certain things like fairly quickly. I need to change certain things about this system or, system of systems, this ecosystem in relatively short term, but then how do I avoid being an oblivious geek in the way I go about that, basically? So.
Wow, that's great. That's a lot of stuff. I think for me, one of the first things that comes up is a question of, is there some way to discern whether tradition solutions are effective or not? And that might have different meanings at different scales. Traditions might be good or bad solutions. We don't want to fall into a survivor bias and assume that just because the tradition persisted means it's one of the traditions that solved the problem we've forgotten we had. And then on the oblivious geek thing, I think of two things, right? There's a problem of the oblivious geek not knowing who to connect up to because they're oblivious. And that's a problem that Marx commented on, Orwell commented on, everybody who was interested in how do you get the socialist thinkers actually involved with the working class people, because socially and temperamentally they tend to avoid each other and maybe not even like each other. So there's a question of solidarity with what allies, and the oblivious geek might not understand what they need to do in order to gain a dynamic solidarity. Then the other part of it is you can be as oblivious as you are insulated from feedback, right? And so I was thinking of, you don't put an autistic in charge of a therapy session or a wedding party necessarily. It's not their specialty. They're neurologically insulated to some degree. But I used to live in Victoria, and the government sold or licensed the public phone system to a private American corporation, which sold cell phones. And surprise, surprise, they didn't really look after the public phones all of a sudden. They had no incentive. They weren't public phone users. There's no feedback mechanism to get through that isolation of the geek. And in a sense, everybody's a geek about things where they're not receiving some kind of feedback that bypasses our natural self-insulation mechanisms.
Absolutely. So that gets us back to the notion we talked about a lot last time of skin in the game, right? It sounds like to me what you're proposing here is essentially that one of the antidotes to being an oblivious geek is to have real skin in the game. Is that a fair paraphrase?
I think that's very fair.
Okay, yeah. So then it's also interesting to think about the sort of tricky dynamics, because you were earlier speaking of the difficulty in seeing, okay, which aspects of traditions writ large are the solutions to the problems that we've forgotten that we had, versus which ones are just some sort of ossified or calcified social norm that is no longer adaptive, or maybe was never adaptive to anyone other than the ruling class of some previous time period or what have you. Right?
It might have been scale adaptive, but then it's maladaptive at other scales.
That's another way, of course, that we can have that. So I think it's really interesting to think about tradition in that sense as being adaptive with respect to scale. I really like that. And that's something that I think that we don't often consider as explicitly as we might. We have, in general, people seem to have, I personally at least, very much seem to have some sort of orientation with respect to tradition, where people either tends to sort of be tradition respecters or tradition discarders, as something of a personality attribute. Or at least I've noticed this in myself and in people I just happen to know. And I wonder if that in itself is somewhat problematic, because it sounds like we're sort of in the process of putting together a theory that traditions can't be evaluated as a sort of a group, as a single class. We have to look at traditions and their degree of adaptivity with respect to varying levels of scale, which of course makes perfect sense given all of the things we talked about last time, but is definitely sort of a new lens on tradition for me. I'll admit I haven't really considered this in this framing, and I think it's quite a useful one actually, is to think about, okay, so what scale might this tradition have evolved for? So I wonder if we can think of examples of traditions that evolved for a certain scale of human endeavor, society, interaction, and which are being applied outside of that scale in a way that seems maladaptive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining a scenario where the townsfolk mobilize against somebody who seems different or foreign. right? And that might have been useful under certain conditions, whereby somebody who visually looked different might be infected, or they might be from a rival tribe that you can't necessarily trust because you haven't gone through the appropriate trust rituals. But at the same time, the idea that if a woman got raped and attacked, it was probably the black guy from the next town, right?
Yeah.
Everybody just gets in on that because clearly looks different, right? And so that plays off valid instincts, but it plays them off in a scale which, when we look at it from a wider scale, we go, that's completely irrational and inhumane.
That's really interesting, especially so. We had riffed a little bit on some of the ideas from Taleb's Principia Politica in our last conversation. And he talks in there, I think it's just sort of a brief note, but he talks in there about the ways that certain traditional societies, the sort of relationship they would have with strangers. And it's very interesting that they would have and this is not 100% universal, I would assume, but it seems to be fairly universal across traditional societies, that there's very strong norms of hospitality when you meet a lone stranger, right? A lone stranger comes into your territory, and there's, all of these elaborate rites or rules. Okay, you have to offer them hospitality. You have to make sure they have a place to stay, or they have food, they have salt, they have water, whatever the scarce resources may have been. But then this only scales up to a certain point. There are some number of strangers past which the strangers are basically killed on sight. Now, that's an interesting dynamic of a tradition right there, thinking about how that might have been adaptive in earlier times. And of course, that's not really a great way to operate in anything approaching a modern situation, or probably for the past couple thousand years before modern times either. So you get these sorts of evolution of these norms where hospitality is still prized, but it takes on the more ritualized form that we see today. And so I think that's interesting, especially looking at, okay, where did things go wrong between, say, you've got desert tribes, and okay, a lone stranger is to be offered hospitality, made sure they're okay. Okay, a group of 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there. Okay, that starts to be threatening. We just kill them without even talking to them. And then obviously anything larger than that, we basically consider an army, right? And then how you get from those sorts of traditions and dynamics to the sorts of traditions and dynamics that you were just talking about, where, okay, we're going to just blame the one black guy or whatever, right? That seems to be an interesting story, asking ourselves how we get from the deep traditions to the more recent traditions, and from the more recent traditions to today.
So it seems like there's initially two questions, and one is scale of appropriate application of a tradition, and the other one is pathological versus healthy instantiation of a tradition. And sometimes those are going to be kind of the same thing, where a solution for the wrong scale is pathological, right? Like if you try to run a modern political system as if it was a local sectarian family-based clan system, we call that a corrupt government. It's corrupt, right? It's pathological at that scale.
Right.
The other thing it makes me think of is the analogy between the traditions we inherit and the biological and emotional response structures that we inherit, right? Like my body might be built that a whole bunch of uncertain, confusing, stressful dynamics could go on. 5 or 6 I can handle fine. You throw a 7th or 8th one at me, and suddenly I'm punching the wall of my own house. So there might traditions might be able to handle a certain load before they become like a toxic version of themselves.
That's a good insight. I think that sounds like it has some juice to it. That sounds like a probably very good lens. So I guess the question then is, how do we determine whether or not the load-bearing members of the traditions that we personally or collectively are holding to are still up to the task, or whether those load-bearing members have ruptured within those traditions? And that, I think, is one of the main dynamics that you see sort of playing out in our societies writ large, is trying to figure that out. Okay, which parts of tradition are still useful or valid, which parts of tradition are not. I saw some interesting survey results recently looking at, the attitudes towards family composition, right, and family structure and income earning and so on with respect to different generations, different married, non-married status, that sort of thing going around. And I have no idea how valid the statistics are, but based on a sort of gut check in terms of people who I know, who I talk to, I find it quite interesting the way that, say, a lot of people of my generation, say the roughly like late millennial or early millennial generation, I should say, the sort of like early 80s kind of kids are in a lot of ways going for more traditional family structures than our parents did. A lot of people of my generation, like my family members included, myself included, seem to be leaning back into the idea of one person in the household working and the other person in the household, staying home and doing, well, raising kids, homemaking, whatever you want to call that, as being a more desirable state of affairs than the dual income earning, outsourced childcare, maximizing for income solely that seems to be popular with our parents' generation. So I wonder if both parents in a household and a nuclear family going out and working for most of the day, and if that seems to be almost a failed experiment and deviation from tradition. And my intuition is that it kind of is, that's actually not a really ideal situation for most couples, most families. Though, of course, myself 10 years ago would have been horrified to hear myself now saying that, because it flew in the face of a lot of the ideals that I had inherited from my most recent forebears in the terms of my parents' generation of, liberation of women, liberation of men, liberation of, everybody sort of being equal. And of course, in these new old family dynamics where you have one partner staying at home and one partner going out into the workforce, it ends up usually being the male partner who's out in the workforce and the female partner who's staying home. And so I wonder if that's an area where that can be played with, right? Where we look and see, okay, so we've inherited some traditions, we're seeing how well they work or don't work, and we're saying, okay, so, the part of the tradition that said maybe one person specializing in outside income earning and one person specializing in the more domestic sphere, maybe that's good. But I really do still wonder whether the traditional gender roles there are still adaptive. Should it, in other words, carry a strong social prescription that it be the male partner? And for many relationships today, that's obviously not going to be the case, because it may be two male partners or two female partners or two partners of any number of different gender or sexual identities. And so then that way of cleaving into separate roles is just not a good heuristic. So I guess if I had to make a prediction there, I kind of see the emergence of a return to tradition whereby we don't idealize a two income household, but an evolution of the tradition whereby who is the breadwinner is no longer so tied to, gender dynamics. That seems to be where this might be going. I'm curious about your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I would basically agree with that. The notion of traditional, modern, and postmodern culture pops up for me.
Yeah.
I think of two different aspects of that. One is we look at traditional cultures, but are we really seeing them, or are we seeing them as hacked by modernity? Right? Like, is Afghanistan regressive, or is it only become regressive through a series of international interventions from modernist nations? And then on the other hand is, if we can recapitulate tradition in a postmodern frame, what does that look like? It looks like a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more complexity and sophistication about those things. I don't know if you ever watched Parks and Recreation, the sitcom.
Yeah.
There's an episode where Ron Swanson wants to take the boys out on his traditional masculine camping thing, and he won't let any girls in. So Leslie Knope starts a girls' camp, and they're doing such fun things, all the boys join. So Ron becomes depressed, and none of his traditional values are applicable. But at the end, Leslie puts out an ad for people that want to do really hardcore masculine style, no frills camping, and a bunch of boys and a bunch of girls come for that.
Hmm.
That structure, that stereotype, that function, and the duality of those functions in the system are still pertinent, but they're not necessarily related to whether you have a penis or not.
Yeah.
So it's more fluid, more nuanced version of a lot of those traditional roles. They're just not as simplistically identified with humans and classes as we've traditionally done.
I think that's a great analysis of that episode. And it occurs to me that someone should do an entire show just analyzing Parks and Rec from a metamodern or a postmodern perspective, because I think there's a lot of material there for sure. Somebody's probably done it already. I should go check that out. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that I think I'm going for here, and that I think we seem to be moving towards. I mean, you look at like growing up in, you know, the 80s and 90s, and thinking about what one's life would be like, what one's family would be like, and so on. And it's really interesting because both my sibling, my sister, and I have really, I don't think either one of us would have anticipated living in a sort of homestead type environment, kind of in a rural area, really trying to get close to the land, growing a lot of our own food, trying to be self-sufficient in that way. But that's the way that both of our lives have unfolded. And you know, this is a really interesting dynamic. We would not have predicted this for sure. And I wonder, looking at, again, the sort of interplay of traditional values, traditional lifestyles versus the sort of new modern and postmodern values, and coming up with a sort of metamodern synthesis there, each of us perhaps in our own lives, we do seem to be converging in various ways. Specifically that I just mentioned. There seems to be a huge amount of interest from the sort of people who maybe 10 or 15 years ago would have been, as a group, considering moving to, you know, California and trying to be a part of the burgeoning tech scene in Silicon Valley or something like that. Instead, considering rural properties and, you know, flyover states, and looking at water quality and soil quality, and establishing a relationship with composting and things like that. I mean, it's really, I think, quite an interesting sign of the sort of synthesis of the postmodern or metamodern synthesis of the modern and pre-modern that a lot of people are working with and kind of tuning into right now, that this sort of class of, you know, cultural creatives is not as an entire group, but a really noticeable subset of that is making these sorts of moves, and seemingly arriving at these conclusions somewhat independently, though of course we have the internet, so none of us are truly independent thinkers in this sense. We're always exposed to the sort of zeitgeist in a way that perhaps our ancestors were not. But I think that this is a really interesting trend in society, and it goes back again to some of the parts of the conversation we had last time regarding the sort of the Taleb people would call fractal localism, you know, these sorts of ideas of really getting in touch with and prioritizing the areas where you have real skin in the game, which is, of course, in large part your local environment. So I see that movement as honestly a hopeful one. It's interesting because so much of the countercultural movements of the past, 40 years, basically since the sort of peak of the 60s and 70s hippie movement, have been not so much utopian as cynical in nature. And so I see it also as an interesting synthesis of that sort of 60s utopianism, plus the sort of cynicism of the countercultures of the 80s and 90s, where you kind of see everything going to hell in a handbasket. It's like, well, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, so I guess I'll make my little local utopia of homegrown food or whatever.
I see a bit of this as the ongoing process of decentralization, where, you know, like the Magna Carta breaks the king's power up into the oligarch's power, right? We sort of move from the kingdom and the family to the nation state and the individual to the planetary and the intra-individual, so that we're recognizing we've got a bunch of parts, just like we're recognizing we should be thinking about the ingredients of our food and not just our food. It's right. There's a general application of the deconstructive intelligence. And when we do that, our mapping of our inherited heuristics becomes more nuanced. So the modern mapping of traditions, it validates some things, invalidates a lot of things, but it's very narrow. As soon as you break that up and say there's a bunch of different qualitative zones of valid human experience, which is what the pluralistic consciousness brings in, then you can map tradition in a much more nuanced way and see that it goes forward in 10 directions usefully rather than just one.
Yeah. And so when you were just speaking of, say, the Magna Carta and the this sort of historical movement of decentralization of power, it struck me as being quite interesting because it seems that there's, I don't know if it's a time lag or just a different axis or something interesting going on sort of beneath the surface of that. Because on the one hand, you could say that, say, in the Anglosphere, the Magna Carta represents a move towards decentralization of power. And yet, I would actually hypothesize that power is perhaps more centralized now than it was at the time that the Magna Carta was written and that those events happened. Because the technology simply did not exist for true power centralization at that time. So we've had a sort of two-track narrative where we have the narrative of power, which is to say we moved from the narrative of the king having absolute power to the narrative of oligarchic power as represented by the system of the Magna Carta to the narrative of constitutional democracy or constitutional monarchy in the case of England, but democratic essentially. And so the narrative says we've been decentralizing power since the 1200s or whatever, right? But realistically, I think that the actual power dynamics have somewhat lagged the narrative, or maybe just been on a different track entirely, where you can see centralization just basically picking up steam around that time. I mean, Magna Carta, well, you still didn't even really have a unified crown between the British Isles at that point, right? So then you still have this kind of underlying centralization of power that continues and continues and continues with, you could talk about the financialization of the economy as being a strong movement towards centralization of power. And that seems to have peaked recently or still be on the upswing and hopefully peaking soon. But I think that's an interesting set of dynamics to look at too, is, okay, on the one hand, the stories we tell about power. On the other hand, the actual centralization of power, meaning how central is the ability to project power and influence across large swaths of the economy, of the physical geography of the world, et cetera. And in that sense, I think we may have perhaps the most centralized power structures ever right now.
Yeah, when I think about the Magna Carta and the king and the aristocrats, it's always something I can read both ways, because I think in a lot of places like, say, ancient Rome, where the Senate oligarchs represent the old-fashioned system that was actually much more repressive than what the would-be dictator Julius Caesar wanted to implement, which was like a more modern system. So it can go either way when you just look at individuals or clusters. I think the real thing that starts to make it modern is that the oligarchs are being bound by a constitution, as is the king, and that's the essentially modernist shift, and that there is a decompression of power from whatever the king and oligarchs happen to say to whatever they happen to say that is in keeping with the established constitutional document and the administrative bureaucratic agencies that have been set up around them. So that could be more top-down power, but there's a sense in which it's not necessarily as centralized. Right? I think we often conflate top with center. And a lot of people who don't want the federal government to do anything think that all top-down measures are centralization measures. And I think centralization measures are one form of collective organization, but there's a lot of official federal collective organization that could be done, which is not necessarily centralized in the same way. Like a lot of the arguments around socialism assume that socialism has to be centrally implemented as it was in the mid-20th century. But if you think of a more distributed universalist socialism or democratic socialism, whatever we want to call it, that's still top down. That's still a lot more power being exercised over the patterns of individual life than before, but nonetheless, it might also be more distributed.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. I'm not sure how strongly I can agree with it. And the reason for that is this. So when you describe the move from the pre-modern to modern as being in some sense reflected by the movement from, okay, whatever monarchic and oligarchic systems were in place before the Magna Carta to a sort of constitutional system where there's an explicit document with rights, responsibilities, privileges, rules written down. And okay, so the power structures after that are going to reflect the structure of the document. Okay, so there's a sense in which that's true, for sure. There's a sense in which that's also, I don't know if false is the right word, but there's something more going on there, right? Because the degree to which the document is followed has never been perfect in any sort of constitutional system. And so what this actually seems to do in some sense is to make certain parts of the distribution of power legible, but to actually push other parts of the exercise of power into the realm of the illegible.
Right.
So what I mean by this is that the pre-modern system seems to be focused on agency. And what I mean by this is the pre-modern system seems to me to, in essence, be a collection of individuals, usually determined by heredity, who are given agency over certain aspects of life and the economy and so on. And so the decision-making process is simply whatever those agents decide, right? And then the movement to the more modern system, the constitutionally based systems, if we want to pick the Magna Carta as a starting point for that, that's as good as any. It pushes things away from the realm of what I would call agency into the realm of what I would call process, right? And what I mean by this is rather than empowering individuals to make agentic decisions without a system of checks and balances, you are instead actually trying to delineate the circumstances under which agency may be executed to the smallest number of such circumstances, right? Like the ideal bureaucracy has a rule for every single situation, right? It has a procedure for every single situation, a form for every single eventuality. And so the goal of the bureaucratic or process organization seems to be to actually prevent the execution of agency by the holders of power to the greatest extent possible. And what this seems to actually do is it seems to push the power, like the power behind the throne, the actual centers where decisions are made, again, into less legible processes, less legible parts of society. So the king is big and flashy. Everybody knows the king. He's got a lot of power. And so you know exactly where to go complain if the king does something you don't like. On the other hand, if you are trying to do something on your property and you are told, no, actually, this violates subsection C of subclause B of rule 1123, then it's actually really hard to figure out who to go complain to about that. And I mean, there may be a complaints department where you can fill out a form, but the question is, where do the decisions actually get meaningfully made that determine the content of that code that you are now required to abide by this bureaucratic organization? You may think that it would be the democratically elected city council or something like that. You go and talk to them, and it turns out they don't know anything about building codes. They have made a resolution to adopt the international model building code for such and such type of endeavor unanimously. And then you try to figure out who's actually responsible for putting together that code and why they've made the decision that they have. And it quickly becomes an illegible soup of different committees and organizations. And you're likely to give up well before you've had any chance to actually bring your concerns to anyone with the authority to do anything about it. Bureaucracies are almost purpose-built machines for the diffusion of responsibility. So I think it's interesting when we look at that to say, okay, so this whole dynamic that I just finished describing is another feature of the move from the pre-modern to the modern method of organizing society, organizing power, and organizing decision-making. And so in that sense, it has an effect to, on the one hand, probably ossify the governing structures of society, to make society less able to change in major ways. And whether this is good or bad, we could get into, but that does seem to be a feature. But the second feature that's really important that I wanted to zoom in on here is the degree to which the actual decision-making apparatus is obscure or illegible to the average citizen in a way that it was less obscure or illegible to the average citizen in the pre-modern times when it was just the monarch or whatever, because okay, yeah, it wasn't just the monarch. He's got a council of advisors, he's got his friends and drinking buddies, but those were actual human beings. And you probably knew who the king's drinking buddies were. And you could probably go slip one of them a bag of coins if you needed to. So just the overall illegibility to the average person of modernist power structures, I think, is a really interesting feature that also, I think, has a lot. And I know I'm tying in a ton of stuff here, so I apologize for that. But where I was trying to get to this is it actually seems to have a lot to do with the rise of modern populism, both on the left and the right, because it seems to me that the thing that unifies most of these populist movements, whether you want to talk about the MAGA movement in America or various left-wing populist movements across other countries where there's actually such a thing as left-wing populism, has to do with this illegibility of decision-making. You know, the whole drain the swamp phrase that the MAGA crew uses is, I think, essentially a reaction to the illegibility of where decisions are actually made, the facelessness of the bureaucracy, so to speak. And so I wonder, in terms of a postmodern or metamodern turn or synthesis of what we've gotten from the pre-modern and modern, how can we return the nexi of decision-making to being more legible to those affected by the decisions made?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there. I go a couple of different ways. I think we do need some kind of healthy postmodern or metamodern return to authority, in that we have to be able to empower regulators rather than regulations. But that means we have to be able to evaluate regulators better than we used to. We need to know who actually could do a good job and then let them do a good job rather than try to supplement the fact that we expect them to fail. And there's an interesting thing about modernity, even though it speaks the language of the individual who's been freed from customs and now has rationality and free speech in a modern system, but it also has an extreme doubt about the credibility of the individual, right? That the public consists of people who can fundamentally be hacked through marketing, through disinformation. The unreliable narrator enters the history of literature as modern literature emerges. There's a sense in which you can't trust the people in the bureaucracy, and therefore you have to maximally bypass their subjective responses and replace it with a bureaucratic process. So there's an enormous distrust of the individual within modernity that's rarely commented upon. Jose Ortega y Gasset in The Revolt of the Masses, he speaks very wonderfully about how, we think there's these expert individuals, then there's these masses, but the expert individuals are just members of the mass who are expert in one area. In the rest of their being, they're just one of the masses still. So it holds this dominant sway. And the modern ethos, I think, runs the risk of constantly being a highly problematic centralized phenomenon. The modernist structure, like the integral lower right, we go, hey, look, we've got 3 different branches of government now, constitutionally protected. That's more diversified. That's less centralized. And yes, it absolutely is. But the thing that all those branches have in common is the spirit of the modern people. And their reigning sensibility begins to dominate in an extremely centralized way through all of the modern institutions. And I think that's where we are. And that's what a lot of the good postmodern critique is, that yes, you're trying to be reasonable, and yes, you're trying to create progress, and yes, you've got these decentralized power structures, but they're actually being run in a very predictable way by a very small number of people with a very specific sensibility, and it always runs to the certain few advantages and a huge number of disadvantages that they simply can't adapt to.
Absolutely. Yeah, that point that you just made about the distrust of modernity, of the individual. I think we got into this briefly last time, and I think that's a hugely important point, because this is something that is, how do you say this? I don't know if relatively new to me is right, because it's something that when you look at the sort of summaries of, okay, pre-modern to modern to postmodern to perhaps metamodern or whatever comes next or whatever, modernity is almost always phrased as or couched as the triumph of the individual. The individual is central. Modern Western individualistic society. And yet you don't hear the point that you just made very often. And I think it's critical for understanding modernity, and especially its failure modes. What you said earlier about regulators, not regulations, right? So yes, taking the modernist idea of having regulators, but empowering them rather than forcing them to follow a three-ring binder full of regulations, that seems to be a really crucial part of whatever synthesis wants to happen here. This has often been my frustration when interacting with various modernist systems, whether they're the local planning department, whether they're a bureaucracy that I'm interfacing with as part of my job role as an engineer, whether it's the healthcare system, where you find yourself in a room with someone who agrees with you that what's happening is crazy or stupid. And yet none of you have any authority to change the momentum of the situation. It's like, yes, this regulation clearly should not apply to your situation. However, the exception is not written into the rules, and it will take approximately 12.5 years to amend the rules. So we're just going to have to deal with it, That situation is one that I think to most people will be distressingly familiar from modern life, and one which is not a necessary feature of a self-regulating system that has regulators that are empowered to make decisions on behalf of some sort of authority. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. And again, I think this ties into the rise of populist movements across the world. And again, I'm familiar with American situation, United States situation, because that's where I happen to have been born and live. But you see this a lot when you have to talk to people about their experiences dealing with bureaucratic systems. Nobody seems to understand why the things are the way they are. And this has always been, one of the most interesting situations to be in. Like, say, I'm sure you're familiar with Gell-Mann amnesia, right? So there's a sort of a similar dynamic there where, so the experience of calling tech support for your internet connection when you've worked for years as a network engineer, right? Well, they are not allowed to care about that. They still have to go through a predetermined sequence of scripts. Okay, have you tried turning it on and off again? Have you gone to this setting and checked this thing, and so on, right? There's no ability to interface as individuals. There's only the ability to interface as the representative of a system, on the part of the representative of a system. And this is true not just for call center people interacting with you on behalf of an ISP, but this is also true of, in large part, officials that we view as having a lot of power are still bound by the regulations of their position in ways that seem destructive to their ability to actually respond to the dynamics of situations in which they are being held in some sense responsible for those situations. So I guess this does take us to the question of, well, how do we know who we can trust to empower as a regulator, but without having such a constrictive set of regulations that determine their behavior and limit the scope of their agency? And this question is one that I don't think we've honestly answered satisfactorily as a society. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, though, because there have been many stabs at answering this question. So what would you say would be good ways to determine who should be empowered to have the agency of being a regulator without being constrained by so much regulation? Obviously, heredity is not a great way. That's how they did it in the pre-modern times. Democracy seems to have some important flaws here as well. So yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's well, let me tell you where my mind first went, and I'll circle back to what might be a possible solution, because I thought a lot about the concept of alienation. And the if we take Marxist critique of the economy as an example of a postmodern analysis of a modern system, and he says, look, where does the profit come from? It comes from undervaluing the labor, and so people are alienated from their own work choices. That problem of alienation is extremely broad in modernity, right? Regulators are alienated from regulation. Bureaucrats are regulated from their own work by virtue of the process to which they are submitted. And we see this in 1,000 air, right? If you go into a shoe store, they've hired a girl who can follow the procedure of the shoe store, but she has no expertise or experience with shoes. And it's extreme. My father's complained about this. It's extremely frustrating for him to deal with a 19-year-old girl at the shoe store who doesn't really know anything about shoes. That's not why she was hired. She fills that role, but she's alienated from that role, right? We're also alienated from the land in modernity. We have all these forms of alienation which go along with the technocratic opacity of the system. So we're in a huge problem of feeling not connected to the reality of what we're doing. And yet under modernity, we sort of pretend that isn't going on. And under post-modernity, we start to critique that fact and analyze the fact that it is going on. And once we start to analyze that, we find it in every domain of the institutional modern system. How do we get past that? I don't think we can do it without what I would call massive internal profiling civilization. We need to get way better at an intelligible, comprehensive, and adaptive analysis of what's inside people, right? So like you were saying, heredity is a very bad way to analyze what's going on inside someone. You're not likely to be a good king because your dad was king, right? When we say, you can follow the script that we gave you in the corporation, that doesn't make you a good regulator either. That's not a good way to choose. It might be a little bit better than who was your dad. It's still pretty lame to be like, well, have you had any experience in this profession? Do you know how to write a resume in the way that people are told to write resumes? Can you follow a sequence of bureaucratic commands? Then you have merit. Like, well, that's not really merit for most tasks. So we need to, that postmodern thing of understanding intrapsychic plurality leads to the metamodern or integral psychograph thing. Like, if we're going to evaluate what's going on inside you, we need to think of it in terms of somewhat stratified emergent layers along multiple developmental trajectories and applicable to multiple simultaneous domains of life. If you started to build a profiling system around that with smart people doing it in a way that accepts the evolution of the people that you're profiling, then perhaps you would be able to evaluate them and start to get the people in the positions where we could legitimately give them power and trust them to have that power. Like, for example, if you were, let's say we had a system, this is my sci-fi scenario, a system where there's a very adequate multidimensional ongoing profiling system, takes all aspects of your life into account, your medical records, your search history, your brain scans, and you own it. You only share it if you want to share it, but you have to share it in certain circumstances to get social transactions accomplished. Now, if you had a system like that, you could say, hey, if you want to run for special control over our resources, whether you're going to be an legislator or you're going to be on the board of directors of a major corporation, we're going to need to see your intelligence scores, your morality scores, some basic things that would be pertinent to those tasks so that we can trust you, so that we can let you make decisions rather than try to hem you in with a process. But I don't think we can do that unless we have a way of being confident or more confident about what's inside people.
Yeah, I mean, this has a really strong resonance with what the Hansi Freinacht books talk about. Specifically, I'm thinking the Listening Society here, right? That seems to be a core part of the model that's being proposed there for what society should look like going forward, right? And I'm in broad agreement with that. When you were talking before the sci-fi scenario, though, something that struck me is thinking about, so I was rereading Snowcrash recently by Neil Stephenson, and he is fascinated in that book about the concept of the franchise, right? And so he talks about how before the advent of franchises, you would go to a new town, and let's say you're traveling through, you're there for work, you're visiting family or whatever, you want to go get breakfast. Well, you walk into a place and you don't know anyone. You walk in the door and everybody kind of stares at you, right? And you sit down, and is the coffee good or is it bad? Is the English muffin going to be better than the bagel? Who knows, right? It's all unknown quantities. You have no idea what you're getting. Whereas with a McDonald's, you know exactly how the coffee is going to be. relatively crappy but drinkable. You know exactly how the food's going to be. Disgusting but edible. It's that, you know, or however you parse that. Some people love McDonald's food. That's fine, you know. But the point is, it enables a sort of transgeographical standardization. The whole point of the franchise model, from one point of view, is the fact that it is hyper globalized. You can go into a McDonald's anywhere in the world and order without looking at the menu. You know what you're getting. And this obviously has substantial benefits to the class of people who find themselves traveling to unknown locations all the time, right? It's maybe less good for those of us that spend most of our time in one place or in a small set of places where we can establish those local relationships, that local knowledge that allows us to figure out what breakfast place is going to meet our needs the best. And so again, we're back to the tension between scale, right? Because at global scale, something like a franchise model, something like a bureaucratic model does have the virtue in that it guarantees a certain predictability of results. I would say it guarantees a predictable mediocrity. On the other hand, the localized solutions are going to have much higher variance, which is of benefit to the local inhabitants usually, because they can always say, well, this is how we like it. And if you don't like it, well, you don't live here. So I think it's interesting thinking about alienation, like you brought it up, with respect to the dynamics of the franchise, right? Because we have the entire franchise model, as I just described it, riffing on Neil Stephenson, basically requires this sort of alienation. It doesn't matter what the employee at McDonald's thinks is the best way to make a cup of coffee. What matters is what's in the procedures. You make the coffee this way, the same way that it's made in New York and Kansas and Dubai. It's the same coffee, right? So this will, of course, have the effect of erasing local gradients of knowledge. It doesn't matter if you have somebody who would be a master barista working the coffee machine at McDonald's, because they don't have the freedom to choose which way to make the coffee. So if there are no master baristas available, you'll probably get better coffee than you would otherwise. On the other hand, if you're in a place with a rich coffee culture and you go to McDonald's, well, you're probably getting significantly worse coffee than you would at a local establishment. So it sort of smooths out all of these variations that are due to the local environment. And this seems to be something that is new as of the modern era. We didn't have the ability to do this before. We didn't have the ability to create a franchise model that could be truly global, that could have a predictability of outcome at a whole variety of scales and geographic locations. And there is utility in that. I have a personal aesthetic distaste for that sort of thing, but I have to admit there is a great degree of utility to having that available. I would just say the pendulum has swung a bit too far in that direction, and we have forgotten as a society the utility of the more localized, higher variance models for things. And in forgetting that, we've often lost the sort of localized metas that would allow us to select people without having such a system as you described in your sci-fi example. Because of course, if we could have that would be great. But we don't currently have it. So the question remains, in our local spheres where we do have the ability to construct non-bureaucratized relationships and organizations and systems for getting shit done, how do we select the leaders of those systems? And unfortunately, it seems that mainly to date, we tend to fall back on the pre-modern models, nepotism, essentially, whether genetic or otherwise. We fall back on nepotism. And, you know, that does avoid the sort of flattening out, leveling a mediocrity of the franchise model. But I do think we can do better there. And so I think that's a really interesting, area of exploration, because it sort of, to me at least, suggests a return to the idea of general talent, or the talented generalist. You know, in our society, we basically say, well, just because you're good at thing X, that has absolutely no bearing on how good you're going to be at things Y and Z. We've sort of adopted a cultural mythos that there is no correlation between talent and different areas, different specialties. I don't think that's actually true. I think that you can identify individuals who are going to be responsible executives, and I mean this in a very general sense, not in the corporate sense, but responsible holders of some level of agency, of individualized executive authority on the behalf of others, and that itself is a skill that can transfer between specific domains of applicability. And I think that meme, if you will, is due for a comeback, because that just used to be common sense. It used to be common sense that there were people who were generalized, highly capable individuals, the sort of Heinleinian hero archetype, the sort of omnicompetent Mary Sue archetype. Well, you get criticized if you put somebody like that in a story today, but those people do exist, and it might be worth our time to find and cultivate their sort of domain general talent for exercising agency.
Well, yeah, we need and will always need a good way of picking up people who have particular talents and adaptive skill sets. But the general population, like, there seems to be something like a generalizable citizenship skill, which allows you to adapt to any given ethos, right? It's the source of patriotism, is whether you can manifest this and whether a lot of people in your nation can manifest general citizenship skill. And then you share a kind of ethos, which we would call a healthy nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Also apply at a planetary scale. It could apply anywhere, and it could replace the old notion of aristocratic promotion, right? Where these are, what is the aristocrat except someone who's believed to be better in general than the specialists? You need specialists for certain things, but obviously the old way we went about picking who was good in general turned out to be extremely narrow and scale limited. So if we could get behind a new sense of what general citizenship skill capacity is and what different gradations of that might look like, then we could encourage that and be on the lookout for it. So that's part of it. Snowcrash is literally the only Neil Stephenson novel I haven't read, because as a kid, it's the only one I ever heard about, so I was always resistant. But this franchise concept is really interesting. It reminds me of, there was a book a few years ago about the somewheres versus the anywheres, and how the system works really good for anywheres, but our meaning making comes from being a somewhere. And there's going to be a revolt, as there has been a revolt of the somewheres against the anywheres politically. So
yeah, that
feeling
concept,
very rootless.
Yes, that's sort of, I think, a big part of the underlying message or the underlying themes that Stephenson's exploring in Snowcrash, and frankly, in quite a few of his books. This tension, is whether it's central or whether it's peripheral, it's always sort of hinted at and discussed in his writing. It's one reason I find him to be an interesting and compelling author, despite his difficulties with tying together all the plot threads at the end of the book often. But yeah, this idea of somewheres versus anywheres, I think, is, it maps roughly, say in the United States, onto the idea of the sort of coastal elites versus the interior heartland types. Though I think the somewheres versus anywheres is a much better way of languaging that, because there are plenty of people that happen to live near me in the Midwest who are very much anywheres, and there are plenty of people who live in New York who are somewheres. And yeah, I think that's a really powerful way of looking not just at who the factions are, but also some of the failure modes of the current systems. I think have to do with a strong bias for both putting anywheres into power, and then also a sort of unstated assumption, or sometimes stated, but an assumption that people should be anywheres, and therefore power should be wielded to make it more pleasant to be an anywhere and to make people more likely to want to become anywheres. When this actually flies in the face of what you mentioned about meaning making having its rootedness in people who are somewheres, right? Our sense of connection to place, our sense of narrative, our sense of our lives unfolding is usually rooted to a specific locale, often where we were born, off maybe a chosen home. But if you look at all of the great epics of the hero's journey, right, everything from the Odyssey, on, the journey ends at a certain point. You come back home, and yes, you've been changed by that, but the journey itself is defined in having a place that you leave from that you then also return from, or return to, right? And I think that's one of the difficult parts of the somewhere versus anywhere dynamic that we see in our societies today, is that we've essentially got a weird version of the hero's journey, where the journey is you leave home and you never come back.
And I mean, that to a large extent, that's because some people who did that ended up with a massive resource control advantage on this planet. And
Yep.
their sensibility then trickles down through the rest of the system. And they encourage everyone else to have that same sensibility because it really worked out for them. They have unparalleled historical economic advantage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even if everybody else can't do it or doesn't want to do it, they exert such outsized sway on systems that the system sort of patterns itself around them. And we say, well, why don't you just make some progress toward becoming one of them if you have some problems? And you're like, that's not necessarily how it should be done. They might even be, freakish or pathological examples of human activity. There were a number of things in your franchise discussion that I haven't mentioned yet that I thought of. One was, as a person who's walked out of the jungle in the Caribbean and into a Starbucks, which I would never normally go to, but you walk in and there's air conditioning and they speak English and you can order a coffee that you recognize. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that kind of international standardization, I don't think you call it a form of mediocrity, but I think it applies at all sort of financial scales, right? The people who are the wealthiest can go to really exquisite, high quality versions of the same thing in every nation.
Well, and to be clear, when I said mediocrity, I didn't mean that it's mediocre on an absolute scale. I meant relative to the same amount of resources being plugged into doing it, allowing artisans to do this thing with the same amount of money, right? So, okay, you have the ultra wealthy version of Starbucks, whatever that is. I'm certainly not wealthy enough to know about it, right? But the Starbucks where you have to flash your black card to get in, cool. Okay, well, however much it costs to have that, it's probably going to be more mediocre than the same amount of resources put into something that truly fits into the niches of the local situation. Was my point with mediocrity there.
There's a lot more richness and variance and things that come out of that local framework. And I think it's pretty legitimate to say that even the high expense versions of international standardization exhibit a certain kind of qualitative mediocrity. And I think this is Gassette's point in Revolt of the Masses, that even if you're one of the people who can afford to go on the space station or climb Mount Everest now, there's still 1,000 other people doing it. It's become less rare, less special than it used to be. You were talking about the barista who doesn't necessarily need to be very good at the job because they follow a formula. And I think that's a hugely uninspected element generating what Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis, which is that people are engaged in occupations all over the world where they don't take any meaning in their activity, that their ability to perform the task is not based in any identification they have with the task or any assimilated, integrated human skill they have about that task. If they can perform these tasks like the bureaucrat can with very little personal involvement, or if they're put in charge of things where they receive none of that feedback from that process, then all over the system, people who don't care very much about certain things are in charge of those things. And that can't help but pollute the entire system with meaninglessness.
And even if they do care, again, it has to do with the freedom of agency that is assigned or not assigned.
Yeah.
Even in the sort of knowledge worker classes, right? I feel like you encounter this all the time. Anybody who's spent any time working in the engineering or, computer science type realms will encounter people who have never really had to put much, or not even had to, never really been allowed to put much of themselves into what they're doing. It's entirely bureaucratized, formalized, procedurized, processized. And so the actual art of problem solving, even in the fields that are most stereotypically associated with it, like, say, for example, engineering or science, has in some sense gone by the wayside. You can make a very comfortable living as an engineer and never invent anything new and never do anything particularly novel. It can be entirely by the book, right? And this leads to really interesting situations where when things do go wrong, as they inevitably do, because the best design systems have to encounter the messy real world, which is massively more complex than the designers could possibly have anticipated, then you have people who are uncomfortable with the most basic troubleshooting steps, right? There's a sort of paralysis that happens where here is this large fat manual stating all of the ways that you're allowed to interact with the system. And if the system is no longer functioning the way that it needs to, you feel incredibly, viscerally uncomfortable with the idea of interacting with it in ways that are not prescribed in this big, thick manual, because you might break something. Oh, you might void the warranty. Oh God. But the thing's not working and it needs to work and you need to fix it. And I mean, the debugging or troubleshooting process from a lived experience perspective often just sort of feels like fucking with something until it works. And that is an essential, I think, core skill of human, or not just human, primate, maybe a mammalian agency. You see other animals, you see great apes just fucking with something until it works the way they want it to. And, so I think that's a really underrated thing, is to have that empowerment, that sense that like you put it, sort of ownership of what you're doing, where you feel empowered to experiment a little bit, right? To play around with it and just, okay, maybe, the classic, like, okay, your old CRT TV is not working, so you hit it, right? Well, how do you learn the right place to hit it? Well, you just kind of mess with it until there's not going to be anything in the manual for your Zenith CRT tube that says exactly where to hit the thing to get it to turn back on, but people would figure that out. And now the idea of like hitting your electronics to get them to work, you don't see that as much. And I think that something gets lost there, right? Where you no longer have the sense of empowerment, because this does tie directly into meaning making, right? We often make meaning through, I think maybe always make meaning through, to tie in Vervaeke again, through participatory ways of knowing, right? So we end up having to participate in a process. And I don't mean a bureaucratic process here. I mean, we participate in a series of interactions, which are situated in time and space, and we narrativize those interactions. And that is the sort of raw material from which we construct our meaning. And in order to have these interactions be suitable raw material for meaning making, there has to be a sufficient degree of a felt sense of agency in those interactions. And yet this franchise model, this process in the bureaucratic sense, the bureaucratized or processized way of interacting and accomplishing things, removes so much agency from the process, from the participatory process over space and time, that it leaves like really poor quality raw material for meaning making in our lives.
Yeah, I think if the understood goal is to decentralize power, and if that's something like what freedom means, we need to understand empowerment in a very rich way so that we can get behind it, right? And part of it is, having the internal capacities for decision making. Part of it is the support of environmental and social conditions that allow you to feel free. Part of it is having a vote or having a say. But I think this idea that we need to have decentralized debugging freedom, I think, is hugely important, right? It's extraordinarily disempowering as a human being and a citizen to feel like you're going to get sued by Monsanto because some of their grain blew into your crop, or that you try to fix your own car and now you're getting shit for it. That is in opposition to not only traditional human self-esteem procedures, but also possibly to the basic evolutionary process. So that's part of my response. The other part of my response is to think about complementary forms of getting beyond standardization, right? Because like one way to get beyond standardization is a return to localism. Return to the pre-standardized and a new mapping, a new valuation of what the pre-standardized actually consists of and why it was significant. And the other way is to say, there's something on the other side of this. There's a more advanced standardization. If I could take Stephen Wolfram style computations and instantiate them into a factory, then why would I make any two products the same way? Why doesn't every car look different? If there's infinite novelty computations that I can automate, then why don't I have push button novelty? And maybe we're going to get there, right? So maybe there's a supra-standardized return to novelty that has to complement a newly appreciated return to pre-standardization. And I see that kind of complementarity sort of all over the place. Like we need an economy that quantizes more things that we didn't previously quantize, like the work that someone does in the home when the other person's at work. That has to count. But at the same time, we have to appreciate that which is not counted. So there's sort of two sides of this move that I see that need to coordinate, in every direction going forward.
And so this is interesting because when you think about, so as you sort of alluded to there, we've traditionally judged our success as nations, states, regions by some variation on GDP, right? And then you have some interesting innovations along these lines, like say Bhutan and their gross national happiness index or whatever, right? Now, happiness is one piece of the pie for sure, but I think that what we're sort of circling around here is that if we're going to quantize things and if we're going to, try to do this thing, then you need not just happiness and not just product in the sense of measurable economic output like refrigerators and TVs or whatever, right? But also meaning, right? Which is not the same thing as happiness. A sort of blandly happy life is often pretty devoid of meaning. You could say people are happy from day to day, but there's a sense of a hollow core going on. This is one of the main themes of 20th century writing, right? Is the sort of the hollow core of some sort of ennui at the heart of a seemingly happy life. And so this sort of points at the meaning crisis. It says, okay, well, we don't just need happiness and we don't just need consumer products, we need meaning in our lives. And this meaning is something which we are just beginning, I would say, to really understand the contours of what sort of circumstances and conditions lead to a greater likelihood of a meaningful life for humans. And so this is definitely the kind of thing we would want to take into account in terms of any sort of metrics that we were going to be judging ourselves by as a society. And can it replace happiness or productive economic activity? I don't think so, because you can have very meaningful lives scratching out a living in the mud with terrible disease ravaging your culture. You can have very meaningful lives as your entire lifetime takes place during a war, right? You say, imagine a lot of people in Europe during the 30 Years' War probably had incredibly meaningful lives and then died on the battlefield at 26 and had never known a time other than the war. Probably weren't the happiest, and the economy certainly wasn't as productive as it could have been if everybody wasn't spending it killing each other. So, yeah. Now, I guess the interesting question then becomes, so what do we know about meaning and how to quantify it, or at least to quantify the conditions which seem to be fertile ground for meaningful lives?
Yeah, I had a thought I'd never really had before when you started saying that, and I wondered, GDP is a funny thing because you're going to take the total amount of official money coming in and average it out to the citizens, and that turns out to be wildly misleading if 1% of the people are taking 90% of the money. So you're not getting a good measure of the economy, but some of that's a fat tails problem. So like what would happen if you calculated GDP by removing the top and bottom 5% of earners first? And then would you get a much more realistic gauge of the economy when you average things out? I have no idea. I'd never thought of it before. But there's definitely a set of multiple variables that need to be calculated, right? And this is let's call it the integral gamble, is that multiple qualitative approaches revealed by pluralistic consciousness can be somewhat standardized into a minimum set of necessary variables to calculate that represent human wholeness. And if we knew what those were, we would be able to, feed happiness, feed economic production, feed physical well-being, feed meaningfulness, feed all of that into a minimum mandala that would constitute the actual gauge of how well a system is doing. That would not only be, we would argue that that represents the well-being of people and peoples, but we'd also argue that that represents the most likely outcome to make that system resilient going forward. That there's always going to be things we don't know about, crises we didn't expect, dangers we don't know how to handle, innovations we have to make up out of nowhere. And so that what is the minimum set of types of needs that have to be met to produce citizens and societies that are capable of handling what we do not expect? But there needs to be some, very similar to what I was saying about what would be an adequate internal profiling system that would give us confidence to empower regulators. We need something like a minimum set of relatively stable, plausibly argued for variables that collectively account for generalized well-being.
Yeah, and that is a very hard problem, of course, but I wonder, it feels like the sort of thing that people are working on now. So I wonder, I'm not as well versed in all of the different integral style models that people have been working on over the past, say, 10 years, but are you aware of any promising ones along these lines?
Yeah, well, there's several areas. I mean, the basic integral psychograph is not bad, which is just
Right.
going to chart stage-like emergences on different intelligences. I think that's important. But then the real question is, how reliable are the mechanisms we're using to get the data with, right? And right now, right, one of the innovations in the last 10 years has been a lot of reliance on sentence completion tests to determine what sort of stage you're at. Okay, that's not bad, but that's still very limiting, because I think one of the things that's been holding us back for years now as a society is we're relying on conscious verbal communication, right? I still have to do my internet searches by thinking of a thing, turning it into language, and typing it into the machine, which is extremely limiting in terms of the machine's ability to return the things I'm actually looking for in my life. Likewise, the ability of people to say things about where they are psychologically, it's illustrative of some dynamics, but it's also an extreme limitation on our ability to figure out where they're actually at. I think it has to be combined at minimum with some sophisticated brain scan and neurochemical data, because it's not the case that people. There was a woman from Holland who was at the 2015 Integral Meta Theory Conference, and she told me a very interesting thing, which is they were applying these tests. 20% of the people failed the tests, and she said what that turned out to mean was they weren't very good at knowing their values or articulating their values, and therefore they couldn't show up in a values analysis test. So we need some additional ways of gauging what's going on any given topic so that we can feed that information in, because we have some not perfect, but pretty good maps of what are the types of information we would need. But I think the holdup is actually reliably getting that information in a way that isn't just nominal or verbal.
Yeah, and so the verbal thing, that's a big criticism I've had of most of these sort of psychometrics. When you think about things like the way you inhabit your body, I think correlates meaningfully to some of the things we're interested in here. So I'm just imagining, again, a sort of sci-fi type system, but, take the enormous success we've had with things like deep learning, neural networks, et cetera, and use that to look at the way that people move in space, the way that they hold their bodies when they're sitting, when they're speaking, when they're thinking, right? Now, obviously, you'd have to account for a lot of variations as far as like the whole concept of a neurotypical person is about as real as an average person. But I do think there are going to be certain invariants, at least that fall into clusters, that you can look at there, because someone who has a disrupted, traumatized, locked up relationship with their own embodiment is probably not going to be suitable for the sort of agentic regulating decision-making role that we've been discussing. So that's one interesting area. Now, The other thing that I really did want to kind of zoom in on here is specifically the conditions that are conducive to making a meaningful life, to having meaning in your life. You know, we can talk about things like, in some sense, this is what people like Campbell were trying to map out with the hero's journey, right? But that's can't be the whole story, I think. And it especially, what interests me is when we look at meaning making, the way that it is so closely tied in most of our discussions and analyses and theories about the topic to narrative, to narrativization. Because I think actually we've got a big hole there. And I say we, I mean as a society, not that any individual thinker hasn't thought of this, but you know, I think Vervaeke does a good job of touching into some of this stuff, and some of the conversations he's had with people get pretty deep into this. What about the non-narrative and non-narrativizable aspects of meaning, and how that relates to a life that feels like it's full of meaning? It feels like you're here and there's some sort of meaning or purpose to it. And even meaning and telos and purpose are not identical. But I think that our understanding of this is honestly kind of in its infancy. And that this is one of the major prerequisites for implementing the sort of systems that we've been talking about or gesturing at in this conversation, is understanding the conditions by which life is allowed to or is able to feel meaningful to people, and especially understanding the non-narrative elements of that. Because if you focus too much on the narrative, I think you end up captured by potentially competitive dynamics of like, who has the coolest narrative, or who has the most hero's journey like narrative, or what have you. And yet that doesn't seem to really capture the essence of meaning.
Vervaeke and I have had several conversations on this topic, and my contribution is usually to promote my integration surplus model of spirituality and religion. And I argued a little bit for it with Jim Rutt the other day when I was talking with him. And this goes back to your initial comments on tradition and how we value it, because there's something like a left and right polarization relative to going forward. And one says we make up new words, and the other says we reinvest deeper meaning in our existing words. And that's the same with our traditions. So I said to him, yeah, obviously we don't need to call these things spirituality and religion if you're uncomfortable with it, and we should have terminological diversity. But why seed the battlefield before the battle, right? Why decide that other people define the word religion and you think those people are dumb, so you don't think you need religion? Why don't you define religion now as a deeper thing that meets your own value standards? And that's how these terms move forward. We update our traditions by deepening them rather than discarding them and replacing them. But that's a slightly, you can call that a conservative approach rather than a liberal approach. When I talk about spirituality and religion with Vervaeke, what I normally talk about is, one is the intrapsychic and the other is the interpersonal mode of integrating subjectively active subsystems to create a surplus that is more than the sum of the parts, right? And there's a lot of traditional ways to do that work on just, say, 3 developmental lines: heart, mind, and body. That I have intellectual, emotional, and physiological responses and intelligence systems. And when they are all working together, then I experience something that's more than any of them, whether I call it my beingness, or whether I perceive it in a second person mode as an entity, or whether it's my higher self or some other energy. But it gives me a faith-like feeling, an extra vibratory buzz that makes me feel like I really am part of the world that I'm embedded in, and that I can count on that because some part of me feels like it exceeds the world I'm embedded in. And I think meaning making is dependent upon some degree of integration of subjectively active subsystems. They could be chakras, they could be heart, mind, body, could be left, right brain, could be conscious and unconscious, could be any number of these. However we want to break those up, they provide opportunities for a synchronization, a relatively balanced harmonization, whose side effect is a numinous extra quality that we point to as meaning. And when it happens individually, we've tended historically to call it spiritual. And when it happens interpersonally, we've tended historically to call it a religious phenomenon, where there's a shared social numinous quality that we're dealing with. But if we don't have that extra, if we're not making a profit, so to speak, if we don't have more of a surplus, of integration of our systems, then our systems start to look like they're falling apart and we can't rely on them or make visceral connection with them. So just the fact that we have a bunch of different subsystems in our society is not meaningful to us. But wherever any two or more systems can be synchronized, then we go, oh, meaningful, right? That it's a process of intelligible, harmonized, coherent connection between these subsystems. So that's my general take on that.
I like that a lot. You know, the religion thing, I think I share with Jim a bit of the sort of background distrust of the word, you know, religion, due to cultural conditioning, most likely. But I think that we can't ignore the important difference between religion and spirituality. And I like the way that you framed that. It has a lot of interesting parallels with the way that Forrest Landry frames that in Eminent Metaphysics, which for me was the thing that really made me able to talk about religion without feeling like I was saying a dirty word, realizing, oh, okay, this is what people mean when they talk about it. This is the baby that's in all that bathwater. Okay, it's the integration of this subjective experience into some sort of objective expression of it, of this numinous quality that you mentioned, right? And you know, there's a loneliness that comes from being spiritual but not religious, right? A sense of disconnectedness from society, or from forget society, from just our fellow beings, right? Okay, I'm spiritual, you're spiritual, but that's a thing we do separately, right? Like we do it in our own little meditation nooks, in our own little caves, in our own little drug trips or whatever, right? And okay, but when we come together and do this, there's a different quality to it. And yeah, so using the word religious or religion for that seems fine to me. And I do think that is, you know, I guess this is sort of the reason that people like Vervaeke talk about, you know, a religion that's not a religion. Well, I mean, I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that phrasing, because at least in the sense that we seem to be approaching the word religion in this conversation, no, I actually want a religion that is a religion. It might not be the ones that I've inherited from my culture, but I do want something that has to do not just with an internal subjective experience of the numinous, but with a collective coming together to express that experience out into objective reality. And I think that is a crucial component of, you know, what we were talking about earlier about the sort of prerequisites or the desiderata for a meaningful life, right? To not just be able to have spiritual experiences or a spirituality that is personal and subjective to you, but to be able to sort of weave this together with the spiritual aspects of other beings into some form that you can all look at and share. You know, that's been something that I've sensed missing from my life, and you know, ever since I had the first beginnings of which you might consider to be some sort of spiritual awakening, not knowing how to share, not knowing what to share, not even at first knowing that sharing this sort of thing was okay and didn't just make me into some sort of like crazy person that could never do science again. I don't know, you know. So I think that's a real nail on the head type thing there. And especially when you look at all of the population level demographic statistics showing the benefits of having religion, even religions that I would think are, well, maybe that has a bunch of undesirable side effects, but on balance, it does seem to contribute to happiness and meaning and fulfillment in life. And so, yeah, I think, you know, this sort of sense of religious engineering, if you will, right? Like, because none of the religions that we've inherited seem fit to purpose for an integral or postmodern society. So the interesting thing becomes then, so what sort of religions are fit for purpose and how do we create them? Especially given the underlying resistance of strongly individualistic alternative thinkers to perceived or actual cult-like dynamics. And yet, just one last thing, what's occurred to me is that when I sort of just close my eyes and envision what an ideal religious societal relationship would look like from my own perspective, I'm brought back to the sort of dynamics of the ancient world with multiple cults, right? You know, of different gods or goddesses or forces or archetypes, where it wasn't something that necessarily had to dominate every aspect of your life, but you could convene with people of like mind, and something that was literally a cult back then, and engage in this collective expression into the objective of this subjective sense of spiritual or numinous, insight or experience or wholeness. So yeah, I wonder. I've heard a lot of talk recently in our little corner of the internet about, this time as perhaps being the birth of 1,000 cults, and I wonder if that really is. Maybe that's the way forward.
I think it has a lot of potential, because I think there's a lot of parallels between what we call the pagan and what we call the postmodern, right? Which is to say, local customizable interfaces into religious-like phenomenon are necessary. And probably, I would make an argument that the big desert monotheisms that have dominated for the last few thousand years are atypical examples of human religiousness. That the actual examples are found in Greece and Rome and the Vedic empires and things like that, where people were allowed to come at it through a lot of different customizable interfaces. And I think there's definitely a possibility for that. Like, we're doing something now that's invoking spiritual things. It's interpersonal, right? The word holy doesn't have to mean anything, but if it means anything, it should mean something like this, right? So that we're relatively critical, independent thinkers, but we have no problem with this phenomenon, whatever this phenomenon is.
Yes.
And when I look at, if I take a stage-like kind of integral view of religious history, what I end up seeing is we've over-defined religion. We've conflated it with the mythic membership society. So these large blocks of mythic participation where you verbally announce your belief in a legendary cycle of characters, and you have the book because you're mostly pre-literate. They define themselves as religion. And then modernity went, okay, you guys are religion, we're going to criticize that. But they took their definition as the given. And when you move beyond those levels, you have to look back and go, that's not religion. That's just the way everything happens in mythic membership traditionalist society. That's how they do school. That's how they do politics. That's how they do everything. So if we want to see what the phenomenon of religion is in an integral sense, it has to be operative at every one of these interpretive stages. It has to be something that is metamodern, postmodern, modern, pre-modern, archaic. What is religion in all those contexts? And so most of that was phenomenon that we would not call religion necessarily. So most religion, getting to Vervaeke's point, it has to be something religious. It has to do the job of religion beyond just spirituality, but it doesn't have to call itself religion, because most of what we would call religion didn't call itself religion. That's a reasonably contemporary term. And if alien anthropologists visited us from the future, right, they would say, when you see, oh, it's sunny out now, I'm going to have a barbecue on the balcony, right? Is that guy a sun worshiper or not? Right? It's but we should be expanding the definition of religion to incorporate all of the religion-like phenomenon that people do. And only a very small set of that is conscious identification with some sort of large recognizable religious tradition. Most religion isn't like that at all. And in order to get it done, it doesn't have to be top down, right? The church doesn't have to come to your town and install religion. We don't have to make up the religion of the future. We have to arrange the interpersonal numinosity production conditions out of which something religion-like emerges, no matter what we happen to call that. But I think we need to do that in order to get anything done and make a better world.
Absolutely. Now, something in there that you said that really struck out at me, because you're sort of comparing the Abrahamic religions of the book on the one hand with many other phenomena across the world, across time and space on the other hand. So the one I want to, that I kind of find really interesting is, the comparison between those and the religions of the Vedic sphere of influence. Because in both cases, you have a sequence of holy books, which were presumably first passed down via oral tradition, were at a certain point codified and written down. Later books were added and considered over time to be just as holy. and yet you have completely different dynamics emerging in terms of the way that religiosity or religion is approached, as you outlined, right? So on the one hand, you've got, okay, you had the Hebrew oral tradition was codified into what we now call the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Old Testament, and was edited at various times with more things being added on. And then, of course, with Christianity, we know the story there, right? Well, you had the same thing happen over in the Vedic side of things with the Vedas, and then you have the Mahabharata, you have the Upanishads, you have the Ramayana. Okay, cool. What's the salient difference between those different contexts that caused the one to turn into these religions of the book, the other one to turn into the incredibly diverse religious ecosystem of the Indian subcontinent? I'm interested to see what the difference there is, because I think that we certainly should be more interested in models that would result in outcomes more like the Indic ecosystem, rather than the sort of unified / schismatic but very sharply delineated sects of the Abrahamic world. So I'm interested if you have any insight as to what the salient differences were there.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't want to treat the Abrahamic traditions as if they're homogenous, because there's an awful lot of different variations, and you find forms of Christianity and Islam that you would call Buddhism if they weren't called Christianity and Islam, and
sure,
vice versa, right? So the basic modes of doing it are scattered throughout the different cultural traditions. But I think there have been a couple of good arguments made about why the Middle Eastern desert cults produce this particular format. And one is, that's where we got the alphabet, right? The famous book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess.
Right.
Right, that those book people, they weren't just book people, they were the people who sort of sourced the limited alphabet, and they wielded that in contradistinction to people who used imagery or objects as their religious things. They felt like they were in possession of the heritage of the alphabet, and that they were defending that against all other things. And so I think that got exaggerated. The other part of it is there's a book called Saharasia by a student of Wilhelm Reich. And it's got some historically problematic assessments, but it's a very interesting proposal. It's a good thought experiment. And what it says was, this part of the region of the world, which was very fertile and where a lot of our ancestors congregated after the Ice Age, it underwent an ecological transformation very quickly at a certain point and became a desert. And there was a huge shock to the people who lived there. And they went into a trauma mode. And they exaggerated the influence of their young male warriors. They restructured the way families were done. They had a lot of quasi-sadistic domestic traditions relative to sexuality, relative to embodiment, relative to women. And that we've passed that on in the cultures that are descended from that. And the form of normal human religiosity got contracted and compressed. It got more highly singular. It got disembodied. And so what you get is a perverse version of normal kingdom religion in the form of the monotheisms, where it's all just one, or I don't even want to see any pictures, or anything that reminds me of the body and life is somehow against the religion, because they were in an inherited reactive contraction mode. So I think that's a very compelling argument, although obviously not a comprehensive one.
I like that second argument a lot. I'm having trouble parsing the first one. It's been years since I've read The Alphabet versus the Goddess, but specifically looking at the difference between Indic and Abrahamic religion, because the Devanagari is, so technically it's a syllabary, but it's also a discrete set of characters which represent, phonemes rather than being an iconographic script, right? And so I guess I'm having a hard time parsing why it would be different to have a system where your holy texts are written in the Devanagari versus where your holy texts are written in a cuneiform derived alphabet as the Western religions were, like why that should matter. One's not particularly more iconographic than the other. So I think that the second explanation that you mentioned about the rapid desertification, the ecological crisis, and the resulting social inherited trauma seems much more compelling to me as a reason for the distinction there. Unless if you happen to recall a reason why.
I think that's right. Like you could make some very nuanced arguments about why this type of linguistic pattern, related differently to embodied phonetics, or struck the psychology of people differently, or has a slightly different syntax, which led to some exaggerations. But I think that's not enough on its own. You'd still need an argument about why they used it that way, when there's other cultures who use their alphabet differently.
Yeah, I definitely that I think I'm on the same page with you about, because I mean, The Alphabet Versus the Goddess is a super interesting book, but it does have certain well, if it were fiction, I'd call it plot holes there, right, with respect to things like that. Yeah. So okay. So returning to our previous line of thought. So we're looking at these. Basically, we're realizing that the concept of religion we've inherited is a non-central example of religion. We're looking at the other examples of religion historically as probably more central to the category. We're saying that we want something that is more like that. So a more central example of the religion category, but with a post or metamodern flavor, aesthetic, value meme associated with it. And so then I guess what occurs to me here, and this actually has some interesting resonance with some of the stuff that people like Robert Anton Wilson were trying to do in the 70s, is maybe what we want is an open source religion creation toolkit, right? Like the open source ecology people are putting together this toolkit for, okay, how do you, create open source designs for hardware and software to do things like a log splitter, like a planer, a tractor, that kind of thing, right? To construct communities in an open source way. Well, maybe we need an open source set of principles and practices for the design of religion and ritual and collective expression of meaning making. And I think that's actually existing in somewhat nascent form through the conversations that are being had and the artifacts that are being produced in terms of white papers and so on, in the vague sort of, cluster of meme space that we met through, right? This seems to be a really interesting area that's under a lot of active work. And I wonder if there are any projects that exist right now where people have conceptualized it in precisely this way. The guys who are talking about ontological design seem to be about the closest I can think of explicitly sort of trying to put together a toolkit here. Or also the interesting. So Lawrence Curry Clark and the Glass Bead Game, right? His documents he's putting together on the Regenerescence also seem to be an attempt at some sort of open source religious design toolkit.
Yeah, I think there's different ways that have to, there's a potential consilience or convergence of a number of different styles of bringing this forward, right? One is to say, Ken Wilber has this idea of religion as an escalator, where you could take existing religious traditions and build in level development, and then have it just encourage people to maximally, naturally, in an unforced way, migrate through to the top levels and redefine the religion from within. So that's a good strategy, right? There's a sense in which we have to understand the apparently secular community, where it's healthy and functioning well and producing some numinosity and shared spirit, that it's actually what we would call religion if we could stand back and have a look. There's also, in the postmodern space, the emergence, and Robert Anton Wilson covers a lot of this, of new religions, playful religions, neo-paganism, magical cults, people who invented something they thought was preposterous, but it became real as they undertook the practices. And I think we are getting to a point like Windows and Linux, right? Linux is for people who think they can undertake their own productions, but a lot of people don't want to go through that effort. They'd like to just take over a standard one. And so I think it can be approached from both those sides. But I think we're in a lot of communities where people are starting to think about what are those basic components and tools, whereby if you put them together, you would start to generate this advanced, contemporary and future-oriented way of satisfying the traditional religious need.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that I personally foresee some issues with the religion as an escalator approach that you outlined there, simply because so many people in our society have deep trauma associated with the traditional religions. And it's not just trauma of their own lived experience, it's intergenerational inherited trauma from these religious frameworks and practices and attitudes towards the body, towards sexuality, towards the things that we've mentioned there. And so it seems like you can get really messy really fast when you mix in a specific sort of like ratcheted or escalator style of human development into those pre-existing frameworks, because of the potential to re-traumatize people and, you know, therefore force a lot of the material from a given stage into the shadow in order to escalate to the next stage. So I'm somewhat suspicious of remixes of existing religions because of that dynamic that I've seen with people.
I think you're right. I think there's a number of risks involved, but at the same time, in a pragmatic sense, we encounter the world as it is right now, full of millions or billions of people who identify with these traditions already, and that forms the basis of the customization of the new religion for them, right? That they might need to hear it in Catholic terms, they might need to hear it in Sunni terms or Hindu terms or something like that. And if we can stabilize and make more healthy and make more developmental existing religious structures, then we can get a lot more people on board, or at least semi on board. So I think that's a real factor. But you're right, there are huge risks, and it's really uncertain, right? That trauma, there's reactive trauma among believers, and there's reactive trauma among non-believers who broke from their tradition because it was traumatic. And then there's non-traumatized people who perceive the religions as entirely traumatic. And it's a very strange melange. I was never forced into religious indoctrination, so I'm in a privileged position of thinking of it benevolently, right? I have some very grand ideas about what the Catholic Church could be, but when I meet by raised Catholic, that's not what they tell me.
Yeah, I'm in a similar position to you in that I was raised without any particular religious indoctrination, but I'm one generation removed from it.
Right.
On my dad's side, Protestant; on my mom's side, Catholic. But being raised and indoctrinated into a religious tradition for both of my parents was a source of deep trauma. And so this contributes to a sort of knee-jerk reaction to even the word religion, right? In a lot of cases, not even their specific flavor of it they were raised in. But I mean, you know, like you were mentioning with your conversation you had with Jim, like it's what I imagine to be a similar dynamic where some people will just like, the R word is so negatively valenced for them that even using the word is problematic in terms of getting buy-in for something as being a positive rather than a negative for human experience and flourishing. So that now what this suggests to me though is, so we've got, like you said, some people may need to initially hear things in the language of a particular tradition that they come from. Some people may be so traumatized by religion in general that even the word religion is a no-no for them. And so it's interesting to me, the idea of one of the sort of prerequisites for this might be the sort of creation of some level of meta language, whereby people who have come through these different ways of experiencing religiosity, whether it's a brand new semi-ironic Church of the Subgenius style thing, whether it's the pragmatic Dharma community, whether it's a relatively traditional Roman Catholic experience or anything in between, might have a way of communicating about their experiences, both their own individual subjective spiritual experiences, as well as their group dynamic experiences of bringing that numinous or spiritual experience into a shared collective space that is less charged or loaded. And so to me, I see maybe the way to sort of walk the line is to appreciate the value of using the traditional terminology and maybe updating it slightly with respect to smaller practice groups and within our individual lives, but then maybe the coining of new terminology without so much history behind it for the use in a sort of meta language process where we communicate between these small multiplicity of cults, and I mean cults in the positive sense here, to allow for the sort of identification of similar experiences, similar values, and similar aesthetics between traditions that might use very different languaging for them.
Yeah, the meta theologians of the future need to be able to have a way of discussing the active components of the process in a way that can be unpacked into traditional terminology or marginal terminology or emerging novel terminology. And a way to discuss all of that and what would work or not work about that. There's certainly, we're very narrow in the way we respond to the terminology, like you were saying. When I was talking to Jim Rutt, I called it a Dunning-Kruger effect, whereby the people who are most likely to tell you they're religious are probably the least religious people.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's also this problem of like how it's instituted in human lives. Like I think a lot of the trauma you were discussing has to do with premature exposure to things. Like a lot of stuff like sexuality. Sexuality is a very normal part of human life. If it's brought to you too early before your sexual systems are installed, then it's abuse. Then you end up with a wobble in your system for the rest of your life. Right?
Yep.
So it's like that with, I think, faith and access to archetypes and a lot of the cosmic dimensions and the self-transformative dimensions. If it's pushed on you too early, there's an integrity breach. You weren't ready for it. And now you are a wounded religious person. You have an incomplete religiosity for the rest of your life. And so I think that the meta theologians not only have a duty relative to the terminology, they have a duty relative to what are the human ethics of how this is instantiated.
That's a really good point, and one that, you know, that does not get covered enough, I think, right? I mean, having had my share of experiences with various spiritual communities and new religious movements and stuff in that vague ballpark, the extent to which it's still, as I would put it, pushed on kids, kind of bad, you know, definitely underexplored, because people think that, oh, I found a really good religion or a really good spiritual expression that works for me as an adult. And they don't consider the similarities that you just described, I think, quite aptly to a sexual awakening and experience, that there's probably a critical time period before which you don't particularly want humans to be introduced to the archetypes, to spiritual experience. I mean, sure, things may happen spontaneously, right? But as far as having it poured down your throat, that can be a lot more dangerous before certain structures have come online in the personality. Now that's definitely something I think critically to bear in mind when people are contemplating, okay, how do we actually implement this? How do we actually do this? It's a nice balancing act between freedom and care for children, right? Or for young people as a group, is the idea that even though this stuff is in some senses the most important stuff we can do or talk about, it's also critically important to respect the autonomy of people who may still be under your care to some extent when inducting them into these particular mysteries. Same thing with sexuality. So that's a really, really important point on this topic that I think is really, you know, we could say just consent to religious participation. That's a relatively new, and maybe that's part of the postmodern special sauce that gets added to the pre-modern and modern insights for this, is the importance of the individualized consent and the ability to consent to participation in spirituality and religion as being something that is a developmental capacity that comes online over time. That seems really hugely important.
Yeah, I think the element of consent, as well as the element of deconstructing the terminology and sort of undermining the classical definition of religion and secular, I think those are key elements that the postmodern consciousness adds into this whole discussion. And any kind of integrative or metamodern consciousness has to make those all work together somehow. There's it interesting to bring it full circle again. There's a scale issue to what you were just saying, or the way you were summing up what I was saying, or whatever was going on there, which is there are certain circumstances historically where you can imagine that short-term survival or even maybe long-term survival of a small group is dependent upon a lot of overriding of individual multidimensional needs, where we're not going to survive as a group unless we just override a ton of stuff we would normally want to do and just all get on the same page about whatever shit is our organizing symbolic feature.
Yep.
Right? So it might be that things that we now call abuse, or we now call problematic religious indoctrination, or even sabotage of flourishing religiousness, were appropriate at a scale. But now we're operating at a much larger scale, and now they are a thwart to the same process that they purported to serve historically.
Yeah. And I mean, scale and time and space, right? Because they may even be inappropriate at the same scale when we're talking about number of people. Like even if, so you had some circumstance in the past where it was important for the survival of the group to override certain things, like you were just discussing. Well, even if you have a group of the same size that exists well after the crisis has passed, it's the same scale in that sense, but it still may be inappropriate to continue that override and to continue traumatizing yourselves basically after the immediate threat has passed. And I mean, this is in essence the group scale of an inappropriate trauma response getting conditioned into you, right? Something that was adaptive for a given traumatic circumstance is retained as a program, as a set of reactions, a set of reactive impulses after the threat has passed, right?
Yeah, the time scale problem is huge.
Yeah.
Like
time scale, yeah.
If there's an uncomfortable discussion in the hut, right? If I have to resolve that in 1 second, then maybe that's punching my wife in the face. But if I have to resolve it over a month or a day or a couple hour discussion, that's a completely different response pattern and leads to a more unforced sense of communion, right? It makes a more religious circumstance. If I have to get to religion in 1 second, or if I have 3 hours to get there, I adapt to very different solutions. And if
Absolutely.
I have to adapt to the short-term solution and then impose that on structures that require a long-term solution, then it looks like the lingering shadow of abuse undermining the entire enterprise.
And if there's a better description for the situation we're in as a society right now, then I haven't found it.
Okay, well, let's maybe end there, because it's been a couple hours and this is all we can reasonably expect a person to follow at a given time, but we'll set up a third one. Let's keep this going.
Cool. Sounds good. We've definitely covered some interesting territory. I appreciate the conversation with you as always.